Some medieval nuns ate only once a day, and for many, that meal was just coarse bread and plain water. Think about never tasting meat again, not even a tiny piece, from the moment you entered the convent. Certain religious women would deliberately seek out spoiled or bitter foods, things others would throw away, and eat them as a form of spiritual discipline. Fasting wasn't just for Lent. For some extreme food restriction was a near constant state, sometimes lasting for weeks or months, with barely enough to keep a bird alive. Imagine mealtimes where no one spoke a word, where food was purely functional, a task to be completed in silence and reflection, not a source of pleasure. Number 7. The bare minimum plate, when less was always more. This was often the starting point, the baseline of convent eating. It wasn't about exotic ingredients or complex recipes, far from it. The food was meant to sustain life, and not much else. Think simple, very simple. The idea was that the body needed just enough to keep going, so the spirit could be free to focus on prayer and contemplation. What did this bare minimum look like? Well, it varied from convent to convent and from one religious order to another. But common threads emerge. Meals were often built around very basic staples. Bread was a big one, but this wasn't the soft, fluffy loaf you might picture. Often it was dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley, perhaps with the bran still in it. It was filling, yes, but not exactly a culinary delight. Vegetables were also key. Things grown in the convent's own garden were common. Cabbage, turnips, onions, leeks, beans, and peas might feature regularly. These would often be boiled perhaps into a simple pottage or soup. Herbs might be added for some flavor, but strong spices that were considered luxurious or exciting to the palate, usually not. Salt was generally available, as it was essential for preservation and basic health, but even its use might be moderated. Fruit, if available, would also be simple: apples, pears, or berries from the garden or local area. Nothing too exotic or expensive. The emphasis was always on what was readily available, inexpensive, and not overly pleasurable. The preparation of these foods was also kept deliberately plain. Frying, for instance, which used more fat and was seen as more indulgent, might be rare. Roasting, especially of anything beyond basic vegetables, was often out. Boiling and stewing were common methods, because they were simple and could make tough ingredients go further. Why this focus on such simplicity? The spiritual reasoning was central. Eating plain food was seen as a way to practice humility. It was a reminder to reject worldly pleasures and focus on spiritual nourishment. By not indulging the body with rich or exciting foods, nuns believed they could better control their physical desires and dedicate more energy to their relationship with God. It was about subduing the flesh to elevate the spirit. This wasn't necessarily about starvation, especially in the less strict orders or at less austere times of the year. It was more about a conscious, daily choice to embrace simplicity and reject excess. It was a constant, gentle reminder of their vows and their chosen path. The bare minimum plate was a discipline, a way of life that shaped every single day. It meant that food was fuel, not fun. It was sustenance, not sensation. And for many nuns, this was the accepted, even welcomed reality of their devout lives. They weren't looking for gourmet experiences. They were seeking a closer connection to the divine, and a plain diet was one of the many tools they used on that journey. This foundation of simplicity set the stage for even more intense forms of dietary restriction that some would embrace. Number 6. The no-meat mandate, forgoing flesh forever. For many nuns in the medieval period, meat was off the menu completely. From the day they took their vows until their last breath, the flesh of animals was something they would not consume. This wasn't just a casual dietary preference. It was often a strict rule, a core part of their ascetic lifestyle. Imagine if you can never again eating chicken, beef, pork, or lamb. For some, this extended to all animal flesh, including poultry and sometimes even fish, though fish was often permitted as it wasn't considered flesh in the same way red meat was, especially during Lenten periods for the general populace. But in the more austere convents, the ban could be absolute regarding land animals and birds. Why such a strong prohibition against meat? There were several interconnected reasons, deeply rooted in religious and philosophical thought of the time. Meat was often associated with luxury, with feasting, and with worldly indulgence. To give it up was a powerful statement of renouncing the world and its pleasures. It was seen as a heavier food, believed to inflame the passions and weigh down the spirit, making prayer and contemplation more difficult. A lighter, plant-based diet was thought to lead to a clearer mind and a more spiritually attuned body. There was also the idea of purity. Abstaining from meat was considered a purer way of living, distancing oneself from the act of killing animals and the consumption of blood, which had strong symbolic meanings. Some early Christian ascetic traditions which influenced medieval monasticism advocated for vegetarianism as a path to greater holiness, linking it to the idea of a more peaceful Eden-like existence. So, what did they eat instead to get protein and sustenance? Beans, lentils, and peas were absolute staples. These provided protein and substance to meals that otherwise might have been very light. Nuts, where available, could also supplement the diet. Dairy products like milk, cheese, and eggs were often permitted in many convents, at least, outside of the strictest fasting periods like Lent or Advent. These provided vital nutrients and calories. However, in some of the most rigorous orders, even eggs and dairy might be restricted or forbidden entirely, pushing them towards what we might today call a vegan diet, though they wouldn't have used that term. This commitment to a meatless existence was a daily act of devotion. It wasn't just about what was absent from the plate, but what that absence represented, a dedication to a life of simplicity, discipline, and spiritual focus. It shaped the convent's agriculture, with large gardens dedicated to vegetables and legumes. It influenced their trade, as they might exchange surplus garden produce for other necessities. For nuns who were ill or very frail, sometimes exceptions were made, and they might be given meat broth or small amounts of meat if it was deemed medically necessary by the standards of the time. But for healthy, committed nuns, the no-meat rule was a serious and lifelong undertaking. It was a constant, tangible reminder of their separation from ordinary lay life and their commitment to a higher spiritual calling. This wasn't seen as a deprivation to be lamented, but as a path to greater spiritual clarity and a closer walk with God. The convent refectory, devoid of the smell of roasting meat, was a testament to this deeply held conviction. Number 5. Water and crusts, the ultimate fasting fuel. When it came to extreme dietary restriction, the combination of bread and water was iconic, even in the medieval period. This wasn't just a figure of speech. For some nuns, especially during intense periods of penance or fasting, or for those practicing extreme personal asceticism, meals could genuinely be reduced to nothing more than these two basic elements. Think about it. Your only sustenance for days, or even weeks, being dry bread and plain water. The bread itself was often not the most appealing. We're talking about coarse, dark bread, perhaps stale, and sometimes explicitly chosen for its lack of palatability. It wasn't about nutrition in the modern sense. It was about providing the barest minimum to prevent utter collapse while engaging in a profound act of self-denial. The water, too, was just that, water. Not wine, not ale, which was a common daily drink for many in medieval Europe, often safer than water, and certainly not any kind of sweetened or flavored beverage. Just plain, unadorned water, drawn from the convent well or a nearby spring. This practice was often associated with specific liturgical seasons, like Lent, the 40-day period of fasting before Easter. During this time, many monastic rules prescribed a significant reduction in food, and bread and water were the go-to for the most stringent observers. Some nuns, however, adopted this kind of extreme fasting outside of these official periods as a personal act of devotion, penance for sins, their own or those of the world, or in an attempt to achieve a heightened spiritual state. Why would anyone willingly subject themselves to such a diet? The spiritual motivations were powerful. Eating only bread and water was seen as a way to imitate the suffering of Christ, particularly his fasting in the wilderness. It was a radical form of mortification of the flesh, a deliberate effort to subdue bodily desires and appetites which were believed to hinder spiritual progress. By denying the body even basic comforts, the spirit was thought to be freed, sharpened, and made more receptive to divine grace. Hunger was a constant companion on such a regimen. Weakness, dizziness, and intense cravings would have been common. Yet, for those committed to this path, these physical discomforts were seen as part of the spiritual battle. Overcoming them was a victory for the spirit over the flesh. Hagiographies, the lives of saints, are filled with accounts of holy men and women undertaking such extreme fasts, and these stories served as inspiration for nuns seeking to deepen their own devotion. It's important to note that this wasn't necessarily a daily, year-round diet for most, as it would be unsustainable and lead to severe ill health. However, for specific periods, or for individuals known for their exceptional asceticism, bread and water represented the ultimate reduction, stripping away all pretense and pleasure from the act of eating. It was food as pure, unadulterated penance. The dryness of the crust, the plainness of the water, every mouthful was a conscious act of self-abnegation offered up for a higher spiritual purpose. This was austerity taken to one of its most logical and challenging extremes. Number 4. Silent suppers and solitary bites, eating as pure function. The austerity of convent diets wasn't just about what was eaten, but also how it was eaten. The environment and atmosphere surrounding meals were often just as disciplined and sparse as the food itself. One of the most widespread practices was the rule of silence during meals. Imagine sitting down to eat in a room full of people, but no one speaks, not a word. This was the reality in many medieval convent refectories, dining halls. The silence was profound, broken only by the sounds of cutlery, if used as hands were common, the rustle of robes, and perhaps the voice of one nun designated to read aloud from a sacred text. This reading was a key part of the silent meal. While the body was being minimally nourished, the mind and spirit were intended to be fed with scripture, the lives of saints or other devotional writings. The idea was to prevent idle chatter, worldly thoughts, or even the simple pleasure of social interaction from distracting from the spiritual purpose of the community. Food was necessary for survival, but the mealtime itself was an opportunity for collective spiritual reflection, not for socializing. This practice transformed the act of eating. It became less a communal sharing of pleasure and more a functional, almost mechanical process. Nuns were expected to eat what was set before them without complaint, without comment, and without drawing attention to themselves. Even requests for something to be passed might be made with simple hand gestures pre-arranged to maintain the quiet. Beyond silence, the setting was often deliberately plain. Refectory tables might be bare wood, the utensils simple, the serving dishes unadorned. There was little to delight the eye, just as there was often little to delight the palate. This all contributed to an atmosphere where food was approached with detachment as a necessity rather than a source of enjoyment. For some nuns, particularly those in more eremitic hermit-like traditions, or those undertaking personal penances, meals might even be taken in solitude in their own cells. This further removed the social dimension of eating, making it an entirely private and functional act between the individual and her sparse portion. Why this emphasis on silence and functional eating? It reinforced the idea of detachment from worldly pleasures. Conversation, laughter, and the sharing of news were seen as worldly distractions. By eliminating these from meal times, the focus could remain steadfastly on God and spiritual matters. It also fostered a sense of discipline and obedience. Following the rule of silence, day in and day out, was an exercise in self-control. Moreover, it was believed that by minimizing the sensory and social pleasures associated with food, nuns could better appreciate its true purpose, to sustain life for the service of God. It helped to prevent gluttony, not just in quantity, but also in the enjoyment of food, which was considered a sin. The silent functional meal was a constant reminder that their true nourishment came from a spiritual source, and that earthly food was merely a means to an end. This disciplined approach to the act of eating itself was a powerful form of austerity, shaping the internal as well as the external lives of the nuns. Number 3, the bitter pill diet, when bad taste was a virtue. This form of dietary austerity takes things a step further. It wasn't just about eating plain food or very little food. It was about deliberately consuming things that were unpleasant, unpalatable, or even slightly spoiled, all as a form of spiritual discipline. This might sound extreme, and it was, but it was a practice undertaken by some of the most fervent ascetics in medieval convents. What kind of bad taste are we talking about? It could involve several things. Sometimes, nuns would deliberately mix ashes or bitter herbs into their already meager food. Ashes were a powerful symbol of penance and mortality, and adding them to food was a way to physically ingest this symbolism, to make the act of eating itself a penitential experience. Bitter herbs like wormwood were not for flavor in the way we use herbs today, but specifically for their unpleasant taste, meant to counteract any potential enjoyment of the food. In some accounts, nuns might choose the worst portions of food available, the burnt bits, the stale crusts, the slightly off vegetables, while others might discard such things. These nuns would seek them out. The idea was to embrace what was rejected, to find spiritual merit in consuming what the worldly palate would find disgusting or undesirable. There are even stories, particularly in hagiographies, of religious women consuming things that sound truly revolting to modern sensibilities, such as rotten food or dirty water. These acts were often portrayed as heroic feats of self-mortification, demonstrating an utter contempt for bodily comfort and a profound desire to conquer the self. Why would anyone choose to eat things that tasted bad or were potentially unwholesome? The motivations were complex and deeply spiritual. A primary reason was penance. By voluntarily enduring unpleasant tastes and textures, nuns believed they were atoning for their sins or the sins of others. It was a physical manifestation of repentance. Another key idea was the conquest of the senses. The sense of taste is a powerful source of pleasure. By deliberately subverting this pleasure, by choosing bitterness or decay over sweetness or freshness, nuns aimed to gain mastery over their physical appetites. If they could control what their body found repulsive, they could more easily control other, more subtle temptations. This practice was also linked to humility. To willingly eat what others would spurn was an act of profound self-abasement. It was a way of saying that one was not worthy of even basic comforts, and that any suffering endured was a small price to pay for spiritual growth. Furthermore, it was sometimes seen as a way to share in the sufferings of the poor, who often had no choice but to eat spoiled or inadequate food. For a nun to choose this path voluntarily was an act of solidarity and compassion, albeit an extreme one. It's crucial to understand this within the medieval worldview, where the body and spirit were often seen as in opposition. Subduing the body, even through such harsh means, was believed to elevate the spirit. The bitter pill diet, therefore, wasn't about masochism in a modern psychological sense, but about a fervent, if extreme, pursuit of holiness and a radical detachment from worldly values. It was a testament to how far some were willing to go in their quest for spiritual perfection, using even the act of eating unpleasant things as a tool for divine communion. Number 2, 1 meal a day. If you were lucky, surviving on scraps. For many people today, 3 meals a day is standard. For some medieval nuns, however, eating just once a day was the norm, and even that single meal could be incredibly sparse. This practice of severely limiting the frequency of eating was a common and demanding form of asceticism. Imagine the long hours stretching between one meager meal and the next. Hunger would have been a near constant presence. The single meal was often taken later in the day, sometimes in the afternoon or even evening, meaning the nuns would go through their morning and midday duties, prayers, manual labor, study, on an empty stomach. What did this one meal consist of? It certainly wasn't a feast to make up for the fasting. It would typically align with the general principles of convent austerity: simple, plain, and often meatless. It might be a bowl of pottage, a thick vegetable stew, a piece of bread, and perhaps some water or small ale. The quantity would also be restricted. just enough to provide the bare minimum of sustenance. There were variations, of course. Some monastic rules, like the rule of Saint Benedict, which influenced many female orders, allowed for 2 meals during much of the year, but prescribed only 1 meal during Lent and other extended fasting periods. However, many individual nuns or entire communities known for their particular rigor might adopt the 1 meal a day regimen year-round as a voluntary act of devotion. On top of this, there were often specific days of the week, like Fridays, commemorating the crucifixion, or vigils before major feast days, where even this 1 meal might be further reduced or consist of only bread and water. So, the 1 meal a day could sometimes feel like a relative abundance compared to these even stricter fasting days. The spiritual rationale behind this practice was multifaceted. Firstly, it was a direct form of self-denial and discipline. Constantly battling hunger was seen as a way to strengthen the will and subdue the desires of the body. By minimizing the time and energy spent on preparing, eating, and digesting food, more time could be dedicated to prayer, worship, and spiritual contemplation. Secondly, it was an imitation of the early desert fathers and mothers, Christian ascetics, who lived lives of extreme austerity and were highly revered. Their practices, including minimal eating, served as a model for later monastic communities. There was also the belief that a body kept light and somewhat hungry was more receptive to spiritual insights. A full stomach was thought to lead to sluggishness, both physical and spiritual. Living on 1 small meal a day would have had significant physical effects. Weakness, low energy, and constant preoccupation with food, even in the act of trying to ignore it, would have been common. Yet within their belief system, these challenges were part and parcel of the spiritual journey. Overcoming these physical trials was seen as a sign of spiritual strength and divine assistance. This practice highlights the immense commitment and endurance of these women. To function, to pray, to work, all while subsisting on such a limited intake of food, required extraordinary mental and spiritual fortitude. It shows how central the concept of less is more was to their understanding of a holy life, where deprivation of the body was believed to lead directly to the nourishment of the soul. The quiet refectory serving its single simple meal was a daily stage for this profound act of faith and discipline. Number 1, the disappearing diet, eating almost nothing at all. This is the most extreme end of dietary austerity found in medieval convents, often associated with mystics and those reputed for exceptional holiness. We're talking about nuns who reportedly survived on incredibly minuscule amounts of food, sometimes claiming to eat nothing but the Eucharist, the consecrated bread taken during communion, for extended periods, or just tiny scraps of food so infrequently that it seems biologically impossible by modern understanding. These cases, often documented in hagiographies, lives of saints, and devotional literature, describe women who seemed to subsist on air, prayer, and the occasional sacred wafer. Figures like Saint Catherine of Siena in the 14th century, though not a nun in an enclosed order for her whole life, but a Dominican tertiary, became famous for her extreme fasting. She was said to have gone for long stretches, consuming only water, bitter herbs, and the Eucharist. Other holy women across Europe were similarly described as engaging in what is sometimes termed inedia, the supposed ability to live without food. It's important to approach these accounts with the understanding that they were written within a specific cultural and religious context. For medieval audiences, such extreme abstinence was often seen as a sign of divine favor, a miracle. The body that no longer needed earthly sustenance was considered to be sustained directly by God, a mark of extraordinary sanctity. These women were often viewed as living saints. What did almost nothing mean in practice? Accounts vary. For some, it might mean a few sips of water or juice from herbs each day. For others, it was the claim of consuming only the Eucharist. The host being spiritually transformed into the body of Christ in Catholic theology was considered the ultimate spiritual food, and for these mystics, it apparently became their only physical food as well. They reported feeling no hunger, or that the desire for earthly food had been entirely replaced by a desire for God. The spiritual significance attached to this was immense. It represented the ultimate triumph of spirit over flesh. If the body could be so completely subdued that it no longer craved or needed ordinary food, then the soul was truly free to unite with the divine. It was seen as a form of martyrdom in life, a living sacrifice. These women were often highly revered, and their ability to fast was taken as proof of their holiness and the power of their prayers. From a modern perspective, prolonged and severe food deprivation leads to starvation, malnutrition, and eventually death. Historians and scholars debate these accounts. Some suggest that the amounts of food consumed might have been underreported, or that there might have been small, unacknowledged intakes. Others consider the psychological and physiological aspects of extreme fasting and religious ecstasy. The power of belief and the intense spiritual environment of the convent could certainly play a role in how these experiences were perceived and endured. Regardless of the precise biological mechanics, the belief in and aspiration towards such extreme abstinence were very real. These disappearing diets represented the pinnacle of ascetic devotion for some medieval religious women. They saw it as a path to mystical union with God, a radical way of emptying themselves to be filled with divine grace. Their stories, whether entirely literal or embellished, inspired awe and devotion, setting an almost impossibly high bar for self-denial and spiritual dedication within the cloistered world. The idea that one could live on prayer alone, or nearly so, was a powerful testament to the medieval belief in the supremacy of the spiritual over the material,